Good evening, welcome all of you. Bande Matram. Here we are going to discuss on open to higher regions. That is the topic of discussion for this glorious evening. Open to the higher regions. See, here actually we are having a occasion to discuss on two things. One is opening, and the second is to higher regions. Opening is a term that is most essential and most required term in this yogic process. You know that is opening is a must. Without opening, how the higher force will come, how it will descend, and how it will work. So you have to open yourself to the divine forces. You have to shut yourself to the anti-divine forces. So this opening is a must. And here, when this opening is there, we have got two options already. We have quoted in these two lines. One, sometimes we open to the, most of the time we are not open. And the second thing, if we have to open, there is two options, one to anti-divine forces and the second one to the divine forces, to the higher regions and to the lower regions, because there is option before us to do so in these two and parallel lines. So what really we have to do, open to the higher regions, that is the topic of discussion right now. In the most occasions we do the opposite. When we open to the anti-divine forces at the lower regions, but here the topic is to discuss to open to the higher regions. We will take it from other right now. If you open to the higher regions of the consciousness, and and the force and the force descends from above, is quite naturally it establishes in silence in the lower regions. See, two regions are there, we are focusing, we are concentrating upon, that is on higher regions and the lower regions. Here from higher, when a force descends, a light comes, a power actually comes down. Where to where? To the lower region. And when it descends, actually this lower region must have the strength. Of course it calls, it aspires in the lower nature that something great should come from the above, and it must be it must have the right of transformation. It must come, it must have a chance to keep its foot on it. It must work there, and it must open and it must transform it. Its work should be there well inside this lower region. So and from the higher region it has to come. That's what it is said. If you want open to the higher consciousness, to the higher consciousness, because opening means not to the, so far this sadhana is concerned, not to the lower process, higher consciousness, regions of higher consciousness or higher regions of consciousness, and the force descends from above. From above, that the force descends, and quite naturally it establishes the silence in the lower region. In silence, here it is quite clear that here in the lower nature there is actually crowding, and that is now no silence, disturbance is here. When that force descends from the higher regions of consciousness and it establishes here in the lower nature, and it creates actually an atmosphere of silence, for they are governed by these higher powers which descends. And this higher governs governed by the higher forces. This forces which is coming, force, light, power, anything else what is descending, it has got higher power, and it occupies, it possesses the lower powers on the lower region of consciousness here. Then actually next step, this comes from the higher region of the mind or from the beyond. This force is coming from the higher regions of mind or from beyond, and even from the super mind, descend. You can find from top to bottom, you can find different levels of mind. Already we have in many occasions we have discussed super mind. Then comes the region of combined spiritual mind after super mind, from top to bottom. After supermind comes overmind, then intuitive, then illumind, then higher mind. And these four, overmind, intuitive, illumind, and higher mind, these are all spiritual mind. Then comes the base where this mind actually exists. So these consciousness, it is descending very interestingly from the higher region, even from the different layers of higher mind, regions of mind, from or beyond, even from the supermind. So when these force, mother force, when these force and consciousness come down and enter into the consciousness of the lower nature, already that we have seen. Higher regions of consciousness, from there this process descend, and it comes to the consciousness of the, enters into the consciousness of the lower plane. This consciousness becomes naturally quiet. Already we have seen that the turbulence, that disturbance, it is perishes. It has been possessed by the matters of the higher consciousness. For it is as though invaded. Very interesting term, very interesting words your mother put it. It is as if invaded the higher force, higher light, higher power, as if it invades the lower consciousness, occupies almost, and with this, the captive life waited her conqueror. It gets silent, the thing it has to do. So, flooded, invaded, flooded by the higher light which transforms it, invaded and flooded by the higher light which transforms it. Invades, floods, and likely transforms the lower region. Then this thing is second, in the second category, mother has beautiful explanations on her own. But what really we have to do for that actually, we must have the aspiration. No, mother will tell you the steps. We must have the aspiration, and we must have the prayer and the call. All sincere prayers are granted, each call is answered. So when there is a sincerity and aspiration, we are calling, we are praying for it, it must descend. But thing is that time we must be vigilant. We must be very much careful to welcome it. And when it is coming, we must welcome. Will open you opening, that willingness must be there. You will open, and this force will enter inside. And when it is entering inside, you must be the witness. You must allow it to work, and you will stay vigilant. You will be in a silent mind. Let it work like anything. Let it penetrate and work. So you try to see it is penetrating and working, and be a silent observer. Help it work. Help it doing the work. Then when it is working, after seeing the method, you try to be possessed, occupied, and try to help it and try to work it in the very interesting manner. That is what, and so that it will work permanently. So, in the next phase, mother tries to explain. In fact, this is even the only way of establishing a constant silence. Constant silence. It will be coming. It will be flooding. It will be invading the lower consciousness. You will be simply observing it, and this is will almost in the next word is it will be transforming. So the only way of establishing constant silence in one's mind, there is no disturbance, constant silence, not only for this silence for some limited period of time, but constant silence in the mind. It is it is to open oneself to the higher regions straight away. If you are opening to the higher regions, higher force, higher light, higher power, it will come and what? This power will come, it will invade, it will flood, it will transform. So, for this, you have to open to the higher region and let this higher consciousness, force, light, you descend constantly into the lower mind. Descend, consistent descent must be there. Force, light, power, is like consciousness, higher consciousness, force, light. It must descend constantly into the lower mind and take possession of it, take and it possess. And here, when this happens, this lower mind can remain constantly quiet and silent. With this invasion, with this penetration, with this flooding, and this lower mind will be constantly quiet and silent. Not for one, it must be a ceaseless process. It will be a continuous process, and continuously, constantly there will be quiet and silence, because it is this one which acts and fills the whole being. It comes, acts, and feels the whole being. So one can act, write, and speak without the mind being active. For that, actually, it need not, need not help the mind to think of itself. It makes the mind without the making the mind active. With the this force which comes from above, penetrating the mind and using it, penetrating the mind and using it, and the mind itself becomes just a passive instrument. Now itself the mind becomes active. Mind, it is the perversion of the supermind. It has got the creative power, but it very limited creative power. Very limited. It has got the role to play. But when the higher force will come, it will start working on it, higher consciousness. Then actually you will find that it becomes a passive instrument. But in fact, this is only the way of establishing silence. It is a big way. There is no other can. You will find that it becomes just a passive instrument and establishes silence. As for once, this is established. Once it is established, this silence, this quietness is established in you. The silence is established. The mind is not stirred by any longer. Now itself there is disturbance, there is turbulence. You can find every time, sometimes some disturbance will be there. Once this is work is done, this quietness, this silence is established in you. The mind is no longer that impulsion you can find does not stir any longer. It acts only under the impulsion of the force when it is to manifesting in it. But it will say, because it has already possessed, occupied the lower regions of mind, and mind not stirring, it is the silence is established. So it does not actually, it manifests in it. It is like the very quiet, very silent field, the force when once puts in the element. That time you will feel, the feeling will be very interesting, that the feeling must be there. You will be learning that the impulsion of force is very active. Mind is getting passive. It is not, there is no turbulency, no disturbance in the mind. It is like a very quiet, very silent field. You can, I can observe very quiet and a very silent field. And then you can find the force, when it comes, puts the element into movement and uses them. Then this is the true field of work, field for the work process which are descending. It has to come down and it has to work of its own. That is what, and it finds expression through the mind, expression through the mind, without the mind being agitated. Because mind's agitation, mind's turbulence, mind's disturbance is over. That chapter is closed. For that, actually, it remains quiet. So when the mind remains quiet, it starts working. Then something great really happens. It is the true procedure. For that only you have to open yourself to the higher process, to the higher level of consciousness. That let it come and penetrate and work within you. That is what the requirement. And here we will take only a couple of lines from Sri Aurobindo's, and to see how really this opening works and how really it works. Mother course, Sri Aurobindo course. Opening is a thing. Opening is a thing beautifully Sri Aurobindo has quoted. Opening. What really this opening is meant to us? How can it be remembered? We can see this opening. Sri Aurobindo tries to explain. Opening is a thing that happens by itself, by sincerity of will and aspiration. Two things must go simultaneously. Two things must go simultaneously by sincerity of will and aspiration. Will and aspiration. Sincerity of will and aspiration, these are the two things which are most required conditions for that. Sincere opening is a thing that happens by itself by sincerity of will and aspiration. Second, there must be an exclusive self-opening to the divine power simultaneously. Exclusive self-opening to the divine power simultaneously. You must see when somebody awakes to the divine person, and in one side, so you are opening to the divine forces, and the second, on the contrary, simultaneously you are opening to the undivine forces. Then just imagine light and darkness, surrender and selfishness. So don't imagine the truth and falsehood. Light and darkness, surrender and selfishness can be allowed to dwell together in the house consecrated to the divine. So for that, for the transformation to be integral, integral must be there the choice. And the integral must be the truth that is descending on the forces that are acting through you. And finally, Sri Aurobindo tries to conclude like this. It is by the constant remembrance that a being is prepared for the full opening. How this will be? There will be opening. You must be by constant remembrance to the. Then this constant remembrance will make the being prepared for the full opening. That must be there. So for that you have to prepare. You have to consult yourself the higher process. You have to prepare within. That is, these are the great aspects. These are the great things which normally you can do of your own. And there is needed with a will to. There is the need of call from within from no, call from below with a will to recognize, call from below from the lower, and with a will to recognize when it comes, and there is needed the sanction of the supreme from above. From the below there will be call, from the above there will be the sanction. The presence that mediates between the sanction and call is the presence and power of the divine mother. That is the most required condition. This mind's quietude, silence is absolutely required for the process and the progress in the saga. Vande Mataram.